17 anys i he de dir que l'Irita i jo ja vam coincidir fa 2 mesos a la seva casa, a Sausalito, a la Bahia de San Francisco, i he de dir que jo agafo una mica de por, de recança primer, perquè no sé si algú de vostès han vist, abans d'això haig de dir que jo ja m'imaginava que l'escriptora tenia sentit de l'humor. Tothom que l'ha vist cantar i fer la boja amb aquest grup de rock, que és de Rock Bottom Remainders, del qual forma part el Stephen King, també el Matt Groening, el creador de Los Simpson, ja sap que és un pallasso i divertit. Però bé, si vas a la web de l'autora, trobes aquest vídeo gravat pel seu marit, on l'editorial li ha demanat que, diguem-ne, que defineixi en poques paraules, en un vídeo curt, de què va la novel·la. La Valle Del Asombro i el Valle Del Asombro. I ella surt en aquest vídeo molt seriosa i molt enfurrunyada, molt mala llet, de veritat. Tot és conya, clar, després es veu que tot és conya, però a mi no em va quedar clar. I en anglès seria a Real Beach, fa la Real Beach allà, no és tan dur, perquè comença a dir el que no és la novel·la, amb un delit, molt carretada. Comença a dir, aquesta novel·la, encara que hi ha anarquisme, no parla de sexe, en absolut. Encara que aquesta novel·la hi ha una història d'amor, no és un romanç. Encara que sigui d'època, ens transporti al segle XX, aquesta no és una novel·la històrica. I encara que hi hagi elements de la meva vida, sobretot, que no pensi que aquesta novel·la és autobiogràfica. I es va pujant el to i es va enfadant cada cop més, és com molt contundent, no? Aquesta novel·la és sobre identitat, aquesta novel·la és literària. Es posa molt ferm amb això. I bé, suposes que és tot una broma, però no et queda clar. Està allà el vídeo i això, ella tampoc somriu al final, queda la cosa una mica en l'aire. Però bé, després, ja dic, vaig anar a casa seva, una mica de por, certa por. La seva casa, que és una preciositat de casa que té allà a Sausalito, molt maca, unes vistes impressionants a la bahia. I vaig anar allà una mica poruc i, bueno, toco la porta i abans de res sento bordar un gos i m'obre la porta l'Ewi. I el primer que diu és, no és bona tarda, sinó és, vols banyar-te'l? I em dona una galeta pel gos. El primer contacte va ser, llavors somrient. I dono la galeta al gos i ja fem cap a casa seva i la veritat és que va ser una velada molt agradable, vam estar també 2 hores xerrant, amb el mar de fons, les avionetes que creuaven pel cel, molt idíl·lic, el gos passant de la seva faldilla a la meva, tot molt maco, i ja dic que és una persona encantadora. I la demostració final que és una persona molt amable és que al final, com va veure que m'havia agradat tant el té verd que ens havia servit, em va donar una caixa per la meva mare. I res, ja ho deixo i ja comencem amb l'entrevista pròpiament dita. Jo la faré en anglès, ho dic perquè és el moment que aquells que no parlen anglès ho l'entenguin es posin els diputats.
Ho sento, no parlo català. Now I want to know what you said at the end of the laugh.
So, I think that you said to me that your mother brought you to Spain when you were 16.
Yes.
I wonder if you keep any memories of that trip.
Oh, many memories. One is that I could speak a little Spanish back then, and that when people saw me in Spain, they would look at me and they would start talking to me. And they'd say, "Oh, yes, Chino or Japanese." They would be talking about me that way, and then I would say back, pero yo puedo entender lo que tú has dicho, and they would be very shocked because. So I would stop people from speaking about me. The other is that my mother was driving through Spain. We went to Malaga, we went to Sevilla, we went to Madrid and Barcelona. And one day we were driving through the mountains and she said, I heard that the Guardia Civil, well, she didn't say it like that. She said, Guardia Civil, if we stop, they might give us trouble. So we have to continue driving. And let's get in an argument so I can stay awake. a wonderful time in Spain going to the museums, but what I remember most is my mother asking me to argue with her.
So not very fun memories.
No, very fun moments. We laughed.
Sorry.
Instead of arguing, we laughed, and we had such a moment, a tender moment of understanding that, that it was more than an argument. Because we were laughing, I said, I can't argue now because you asked me to come up with an argument. And by then we had repaired a number of the problems we had with this boyfriend who was now gone from my life.
Big problems with that boyfriend.
Well, I didn't know why she didn't like him. He was very romantic, and he didn't have a job. He was a deserter from the German army. He was very good at foosball. You know this foosball thing? He was an expert, and because he played all day. That's why he was so good. My mother, she just couldn't appreciate him.
And it is not very well known that you work with physically and mentally disabled children as a sort of speech therapist. More precisely, your field of expertise was language acquisition. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that experience made you look at language in another way, or maybe you could even have some impact in your writing.
Well, I've always loved language and words since I was a little child and saw the world through the imagery of words. But I think that job working with children with disabilities had more to do with expanding me in a spiritual way, in a compassionate way toward this world that the parents occupied with these children who were not born as perfectly as they had imagined. These were children who were born with Down syndrome or mental retardation, cerebral palsy, and when they were talking about their dreams for their child, and the child was never going to learn to talk, I had to put aside all my expertise about language and learn that communication is about what we all desire to say to one another, and how these children and parents would still say that to each other without words. And so this is a job that had more to do with increasing my sense of humanity and humility, and that more than anything was excellent training for me to be a writer.
And in order to write several of your books, including this last novel, you've had to go very deep into very delicate and intimate family matters. Up to which extent is this process rewarding and luminous, but also painful, and mentally exhausting?
Yeah, I had to go into a lot of the stories that had been told to me in the past about my grandmother, and there were two sides of that. The feelings about what had happened to my grandmother toward the end of her life. My cousins held one position, that their grandfather had been a good man, a man of good deeds, and that he had not really mistreated our common grandmother. I heard another side that he had raped our grandmother and forced her to become a concubine in his house. In doing research for this book, I found more information out that led us to come together to a more aligned position on what might have been the case. And I just had a conversation with them recently, and we were talking about all of the stories that we had been told, and I said, I think it was a love story, actually. And they said, yes, they think it was a love story. And so that was the most sensitive part of that. And now we have come to agree with one another that there is love that went on. It was not just tragedy.
And you declared that you don't feel yourself being neither brave, neither vulnerable for the fact of, revealing so much about your family, your inner feelings. You don't think it takes courage,
It's not so much courage on my part. I think it is a sensitivity to respect of my grandmother and my mother, as well as to my family, thinking what they might be sensitive to. A writer is interested in truth and in representing something in a certain way, and so we don't look at the truth or the secrets in quite the same way. I had a great deal of hesitation about saying certain things about my grandmother, thinking she might be standing right beside me, saying that is a terrible thing for you to say. You're guessing at something. And in fact, if anything went wrong in my life the day that I was writing, I thought, is she telling me she's like when I'm writing? So that was the vulnerability. That was the, not bravery so much. I remember one day when my computer kept falling apart, and I get a virus, or the printer didn't work, or the backup was lost, and I thought, is she telling me, stop writing like this? And then other things would happen, lucky things would happen, where I would get more information that would come to me serendipitously. And I thought, oh, maybe she is helping me now, and I'm going into the right direction. In truth, only I would know what is the right direction, and I have to do that with, great heart in deciding where the story goes and how it intersects with my family.
That's it. And 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we had here the wife Jaume was born in the States, but she's from Indian roots, that's Indian parents, and she said that she felt she belonged to whatever the place her husband and her sons were at every moment. Where does Amy Tom feel she belongs to?
I belong to the California Bay Area because that's where my family is. So it's like what Duke said, but it's the family, my brother, my cousins, and also my husband. Fortunately, my husband and I do travel and we feel at home with each other anywhere, but when you've been to my home, you know the kind of peace that I feel there, and it's where I write and where my imagination comes out. It's home.
Do you remember your first trip to China, to your roots? When did that take place, and what impression did you
Well, first, I decided to go to China because I thought my mother was going to die. I had a scare in which I was told she had a heart attack, and I didn't know until 4 days later. And so when I was going to the telephone, I said, if she lives, I promise I'll get to know her, I'll listen to her stories, and I'll go to China with her and meet her daughters. And she lived. She didn't even have a heart attack, so I had to go. And I had to sleep in the same bed with her 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and it was terrible. It was horrible. It was like torture. It was like being a child again. But it was also the most wonderful thing I could have done. In China, she would say, the same warning she'd given me when I was a child. But she always said, eat this. And I'd say, well, what is it? And she'd, don't ask, just eat it. It's nutritious things. And now all I could do was laugh because I didn't have to be the rebel anymore. I got to meet my sisters for the first time and recognize that they didn't have our mother growing up, and they had always longed for her. And I did, and I didn't always appreciate her. And there was that dramatic difference between our lives. I also was feeling this is the country that is a strange place to me, and yet this is my past as well, because it was the past she grew up in, and therefore it's a country I belong to, even though I'm a stranger here.
And which would you say that the main changes, revolution that the Chinese society has gone through, from your mother's generation to your generation to the present generation of young people?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a clear arch of changes and revolution?
Well, one of the big changes with women from the time my mother lived there is they could do things like get divorced, or they didn't have to rearrange marriages, or they could get an education. That changed gradually with the culture. All these had permutations as time went by, whether it was no longer a matter of gender that determined whether they could go to get an education. It had to do with the background of their mother, their father. as a change in China with those we saw on the television in 1989, those who wanted democracy. And there was that ideal of changing China to be more open. And I think that they became more open in certain ways, that they had become economically successful. But I also think that there is a pride in the Chinese mind, and that it is not a Western mind, that it is kind of a mistake to think of the modernization of China as to be the same as a Westernization of China. China has always been very good at absorbing influences. The Chinese side always rises to the top. It's a very interesting time in China. It's an interesting time for us to be going there and seeing what is there, and also how they view people who are not Chinese. I think if you've never been to China, you would be surprised. It is the most modern airport I've been to is in China. The most modern hair salon is in China. The most technically challenging hotel with all kinds of things I couldn't figure out how to work, that was in China. This fast change in China, but there's something very intrinsically Chinese in it that they have a lot of pride in, and I don't think we quite understand.
I'm going to your novel. Let me read this. In the Valley of Amazement, you take the reader to the world of Chinese courtesans at the beginning of the 20th century. Which were the main misconceptions that you probably held about this world when you started to research, and that most readers hold when starting to read, and that the novel finally will dissipate about it?
Well, first I was reluctant to write about courtesans because of all the cliches I had, and that people probably had about them, that they were, exotic, submissive women, sexual creatures, that these were women who were complete victims. And what I found as I was doing the research is that, yes, there was, some kind of sexuality involved, that in fact, 1 out of every 100 women during that period was involved somehow with that. And it had a lot to do with poverty, and the fact that women at that time had very few choices to survive. If their husbands died, if their families lost their fortunes, if they were kidnapped, they were subjected to whatever was presented to them, and sometimes their only choice was to go into this world of prostitution. The life of the courtesan, they weren't like geishas. They weren't exotic flowers who, had this secret life behind the fan. They were more like my mother or friends that I had who had strong minds, that were very persistent. They had grievances, they had friendships among their fellow courtesans. And what surprised me most of all in reading about the literature is how smart and clever they were as business women. And that struck very true to me, because every Chinese woman, a Shanghainese woman I know, and I consider myself being the daughter of a Shanghainese woman, and being able to say, well, yeah, Shanghainese. Every Shanghainese woman I know is very fierce, very strong, persistent, can be stubborn, and can be very clever and shrewd. And I have to think that, maybe being descended from Shanghai women, that is the reason why many women of that period, having been either concubines or in positions that were not of their own choosing, and having somehow risen up to find their own lives, in any case, anyway.
And Shanghai seems to have erased most of its recent past, at least in terms of neighborhoods and buildings. So I would like to know, how did you manage to recreate with such detail that period, not being able to go to see the places? And what was the craziest thing you did for research purposes?
Well, I read a lot of books and looked at maps, and also visited places that had furniture at the time. The furniture of courtesan houses, believe it or not, were more Victorian than they were anything. That was because they were bringing in popular culture. They were the creators of popular fashion. They were the ones who would have spittoons or velvet curtains. And they would be like Lady Gaga and creating fashions that were outrageous and popular. And so I had to look up any furniture from the Victorian era. I also walked the streets of Shanghai that was the settlement, the international settlement where this story takes place. The house that our family is still there in the international settlement. And the house on the island where my mother and grandmother, but that still exists. So as I was walking down the street, I could imagine them being there. But they didn't have the internet cafe in those days or the massage parlor, but I could still picture it. The width of the street is the same. So the dimensions are still there. The names of those streets where the courtesan houses were, they were names of alleys, and Shanghai has changed so much of its history, so the names of those alleys have changed over time. And I wasn't able to really find those courtesan houses. But what I did to try and get a sense of what it was like to live in that period of time, I think this goes with the craziest thing I ever did. Is I took a train from Shanghai with my sister, who lived in Shanghai at the time. And I went to a little village about 250 miles away, a tiny little village, and there was a house that was owned by a rich merchant. And I wanted to know what it was like to live in such a house. And a wealthy man lived there with his many wives. So I know now it is miserable. It was so cold. And I froze every night. My husband was there too. We couldn't sleep together because the beds were so small. We would have been fighting each other for the blanket. And I was with another writer, Lisa C. I don't know whether you know her. She's written Snowflower and The Secret Fan. We are friends and we went together. And at first I told Lisa, I think we should stay there for 2 weeks so we can just sit there and write in this wonderful old atmosphere in China. And she said, I think 4 days are enough. I was so glad I used to do it. It was so cool. So that I consider crazy in a way, unnecessary, but you have to know what the conditions were to really write with the genuine feeling of having been there.
Nevertheless, no matter how remote the village is, you told me that the cell phone connection is amazing.
It is. I went to a place that even more remote than that, in a province called Guizhou, and in the mountains of Guizhou with a minority community, the Dong, and climbing at first, it's very remote. To get into that village, you go 12 hours over bumpy roads. And then in the village itself, I walk up the mountains and clear up to the top and take out my cell phone. It's $4. Oh, well, so much for isolation. But part of this, I think I'm just guessing this, but it is the way that that people can keep track of what's going on, meaning the government, that they can really keep in tune with what people are doing. That it is monitored everywhere, and I knew that was true because when I was in China, I went someplace my uncle didn't approve of, and my uncle was he was a pretty high up, like the vice minister of labor for all of China. And he would have me followed. And I would think, how did he know I was here? And the car would show up. And I'd find out that he knew exactly where I was. So I think the cell phone coverage is so that people would always know where I was and where a lot of other people were.
It's a bit creepy.
Yeah.
And am I wrong, or the mystery about your grandmother being a courtesan or not has not yet been solved?
You mean whether it's coming back or?
Whether she was not
My grandmother.
your grandmother.
I would say it was probably true she was a courtesan, but it's a serious thing to say, even though you and I would not have a moral judgment on somebody who was a courtesan, because you know people didn't enter into that voluntarily. It still would be considered shameful back then to say that, or even now people would look upon it as being shameful. So I have a real hesitation, unless she was standing right here saying it's true, or if I found a piece of paper that had her registered as one, I would be reluctant to say that I thought that 100%. In part, I have the photos. I have some information about what was said about her nature, and that she wasn't old-fashioned, as I had been told before. But a photograph doesn't tell everything. I have a photograph of me in a rock and roll band. And in this rock and roll band, I have a police cap on. I have leather boots up to here. I have chains around my neck and around my arms. I have a whip in my hand. And I look like a dominatrix. And I would hate for somebody to say 100 years from now, look at this photo. And you can't. She was a dominatrix. I'm not.
I'm fine with that, I'm fine.
You wouldn't judge me poorly though, if I were.
Absolutely not. And in the Valley of Amazement, your main characters are strong, determined, very capable women, eager to fight, and to get over things, overcome obstacles. Well, most men are pretty mean and dishonest and tend to cheat. Do you think we usually get too much the other way around? And in fiction, be that novels, be films, be TV. So you somehow wanted to reverse gender roles and cliches.
I never get a complaint from a woman on how men are represented in my book. The only people who complain are men.
Just expressing that.
No, I know.
Not complaining.
But what they do, when a man, well, you make us look terrible, or, Chinese men, you make Chinese men look terrible, and you should have positive role models and everything. But I'm not writing about a role model, I'm writing about men, women, like my mother had a terrible time, and I'm sorry I can't change that they were really good, but I said, I think it's a good idea that we have more books about really fine men who never betrayed women, and that, why don't you write that book? And that would be the way to get that. Seriously, I think that I can only write the book that is in me, and it just so happens that the women whose hardships were in, the women in my family, their hardships were in part based on the society that existed in that time. And when we look back at that society, we would consider the people, the men who created that, to not be quite as admirable today. They had the right, in a way. They wouldn't have been considered wrong for them to have sex with these little slave girls. It wouldn't have been considered wrong for them to decide that this girl was going to have to marry this man.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it was. But now we look at it and say, well, that person was bad to have done that. Mm-hmm. In part, we say it's society that allows us in some way to live out what our character will be within the limits of that society, whether we go out of it or remain in it, take advantage of it, or not.
How are your books generally received in China?
I'm amazed how well it is received, because I always thought I would get people saying, oh, that's not what China is like at all. That's not what my mother is like. But by and large, I've had readers say that, you've described exactly the relationship that my mother and I have had. One of the most surprising remarks I had occurred when I was in Shanghai at a hotel called the Mansion. There was a place, a club club that belonged to a former gangster who was the most famous gangster in Shanghai and was at my mother's wedding. But in this hotel, I had just checked in, and I hear a knock at the door, and there's a young man, and he has my suitcases. And he said, Amy Tan? And I said, yes. And then he looked at the tag, and he looked at me, and he said, the Amy Tan? And I said, he said, the writer, Amy Tan? Now he is saying this in English, okay, he's this Chinese man saying, Amy Tan, the writer? And I said, yes. And he said, I can't believe it, I love your books, I love Joy Luck Club. And I said, you read my books? Of course, Joy Luck Club was my favorite. I said, you read it in English? He said, of course. I said, I have never heard a man who brought me luggage to my room who even knew I was the Amy Tan or that I had written any book, let alone someone who has read it in English here in China. That's also an indication how different China is. That you have bellhop who has read my books.
So no complaints from Chinese men, just Spanish men.
There are complaints from men or women or government officials. I haven't heard it. So
Never seen a letter from the authorities.
No, I don't know. I haven't heard that they disapproved of the subject matter of courses. I doubt there would be a movie made of this in China. But I have not heard the official government one. It actually is in the process of being translated, so I don't think they would have a reaction until after that happens.
Changing of subject, you have gone through very, very harsh experiences in your life, many deaths in the family, you've been close to death also, several accidents, sickness, up to the extent that you have declared possessing survival skills. Right? So where have you found the strength to fight the fear of all these things, generally? And has writing played a significant role?
Writing to me, is always a meditation on memories, about questions I have, confusions, a lot of just uncomfortable feelings. So I think that it is not that I'm trying to conquer fears that through writing, but that writing unconsciously without my thinking about it brings up fears that I didn't know I had, and then makes me look at that and understand it better. It doesn't solve it. Maybe I'm still scared of who I am, but it's more a way of bringing up what has always maybe I've been a little hesitant to look at. I find more that makes me want to discover things, to not be afraid. Because the more I go into something, what it does, okay, here's the thing. It makes me observe my world more closely. It makes me want to observe more, because there I am in the room of my mind, and I have to observe every single detail. And that gives me the practice to look out. So, for example, I'm so fascinated with natural history, with the natural world. And I think it's because of my wanting to write about it that it allows me now to go into the natural world, go swimming in oceans, for example, to see more. And what happens is when I see more, I have a different reaction in me. And so discovering more about nature enables me to know myself.
And you told me also that you thought about that very frequently.
Yeah. I think about death every day, actually. It's the nature of death it's so odd. The idea that here we are, we're wearing this red dress, and we're talking, and we have shared time in Sausalito together, and then one day we're gone. And what does that mean? What is the time between taking our first breath and taking our last? So it makes me think about memory and all the time, and what my life is about. Well, I get to think about that when I'm writing. And so it doesn't make me afraid of death, but it still makes me think how strange it is that we don't exist in this particular world. It makes me think about what continues to exist. And I think there is something, I don't know exactly what it is, but a kind of consciousness, a kind of emotion, some quality about love that continues. I feel in part that that's true because I've had experiences, and I suppose you call them experiences with spirits. I don't call them ghosts because people have a very biased notion of ghosts as being some kind of phantom that is there, they're haunted, they're scared, they want to scare you, and I don't think of it that way. But those experiences in writing and how the sense of a spirit comes to me when I'm writing makes me feel that death is going to be interesting. I just think I have to decide what we're going to do with the body. That's the crazy part. I want to be wearing a red dress when I go.
And you're heading away from the literary publishing.
Not soon, not this red dress in Barcelona.
A good time like tomorrow. I was telling you that you've been away from the literary and the publishing world for 7 years at least. Have you found any changes and surprises in the last time you were around?
In Barcelona?
No, in the literary world in general.
The literary world. My writer friends and I, yes, we comment on it. The world has changed. It's not as hospitable, not as friendly, not as loyal, not as, something. I mean, I find that the readers here are much more loyal. That I was told, that they see the name and they want to read a book, and people remember you. And in the United States, I think it's gotten a little scary. I've been very lucky, the book has done very well in the United States, and people have been very kind. But I have friends who are writers, and it has not been as kind. What we say to ourselves, all of us who are writers, is how grateful we are to still be published. Because we also have friends who won the prizes, who are amazing writers, and they are no longer published. They are no longer read, and you just wonder what happened. I think of publishing now as having something that I can, sort of similar to ADD, this attention deficit disorder, where there's attention placed on one book, huge amount of attention, social media and everything, and then there's attention placed on the other. And I don't know if social media has played a part in that, where we just focus one, like, and then we just keep moving from one thing to the other. But those readers that are out there that we really, really appreciate are the people who read because they've always loved to read the story. They would have picked up the book 100 years from now and said, I want to read this story, not because it's in social media right now. So, as we all know, it has been changed by the e-book, the digital book. It's been changed by the way that young people are so absorbed in the thing that's in front of them, and it's the same with me, all the competitions for time, it's changed. At the same time, I think we've got book clubs, at least in the United States, we have book clubs that encourage people to read as a social event. And there are people who never would have read quite as much because of e-books. They can take many books with them on the train or the plane or waiting in the doctor's office. So who knows how it will all shake out. appreciate bookstore people so much for having faith that these books will sell. I appreciate publishers. I tell my publishers all the time, thank you, thank you, thank you for publishing me. It's an act of faith, it really is.
I can see tears now on the faces.
Yeah, no, but they know. I say this to my publisher, to my agent. You can ask them. You can ask my brother, my husband, whatever. Do I say these things? I do. Thank you.
You studied classical piano for 15 years?
Yeah.
Classical piano. I would like to know what did music bring to your life? But also, you wrote an opera.
Yeah.
But you don't want to repeat the experience. We could talk about music in general.
I used to hate playing the piano when I was a child. I was forced to sit on the bench and play for an hour a day. And if you're 5 years old or 6 years old, an hour a day is half of your life. But I continued to do this until I was about 20. And looking back, I'm so grateful that I was forced to do this because I have a deep appreciation for music. And I also think that it contributed to my storytelling. When you look at a sonata, for example, you see that there are these movements, these episodes in how the sonata is constructed. You have thematic motives. You have these motives that are carried throughout, and they gradually transform and then they return. And it's very much like a novel. You have a theme that goes from a major mode to a minor one. So much like a novel. And so I think it gave me a sense of structure for storytelling. Music also is much more important to me than, say, going to the movies. I love the movies, but I go to the symphony and the opera more, and I do find that when music is played beautifully, I move to tears. So when I was offered the opportunity to write a libretto for an opera, I said, of course, no. Didn't know how libretto was done or how opera was done. I got tricked into it in a way, just to start, because the libretto is going to begin. But then I realized here it brought together the story that I grew to love through playing the piano, and it brought together the composer who creates the music. And what we did together was to recreate a story based on one of my novels, and to break it into these parts, the movements, and then for him to write the music, and for me to tell the story in the way that would most enhance the music. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And now I know how operas are made. It's made through emotion and through knowing it's the music that's the most important, the performance of emotion on the stage. I would never do it again because it cost me a couple of years out of my life, years that I could not be writing. I had to raise money for the opera. I had to go through a lot of tension when things were falling apart during the production. It was, though, a completely satisfying creative experience. That part, those days, I can remember when we talked about it and the music came together and the composer would sing it back to me. It's magnificent. It brings, the kind of thing that does bring you to tears when a baby is born, when music is born. You just have to cry.
Without leaving the world of music, you seem to have a lot of fun dressing up as a dominatrix. I'm really interested in the dominatrix side with the band, with the rock that Remedios. Is singing in this band, the funniest way to leave aside the isolated, the formal, the thorough right side of you, and to bring out in a way the clownish side.
Yeah. I joined this band with a misunderstanding. I thought that all I had to do was wear costumes. I was busy picking out my costume, and then I heard that I'd have to sing. I said, sing? can't. Ah. And I told the organizer, I said, I can't sing. And she said, oh, do you have a conflict with the date? I said, no, I can't sing. And, she made me practice at a karaoke bar. But it was terrifying. Nothing came out of my throat. I was trying to practice to become a better singer, just like the piano child, practicing, and I would get better and better. I didn't get any better. But I realized that I could still have fun. It wasn't about me getting better and impressing people that I had a great voice. It was about connecting with the audience. Some people can connect with an audience because they have amazing voices. I can connect with an audience by letting them see how ridiculous I am. And I discovered something very, very important, and that is that every performance is different. You could read the same thing, you could say the same things. It is different every time because the audience is different. And when the audience reacts to you in a performance, you react differently. There's a saying, I think, that what the audience gives the performer is what the performer gives back. And so when you give more, you get more. And that was so important to me because I used to hate going in public and talking about my books or reading my books aloud, and that's the same thing. But no, it was different. And that was the key, to know that it is a connection with the audience. And they have to perform as much as I have to perform.
The band is coming back. You had plans to return with the band?
We retired in 2012, and then we had our first reunion in 2013. Yeah, we'll probably continue because we love each other as friends, and it's fun to whip Stephen King's butt, and it's great to sing off key with Matt Brady, and we have incredible members of our band, and they win big prizes, literary prizes, and they're willing to put wigs on and sing off key. And we also say we'd do it if we had no audience. We would just get together in somebody's garage and play, and be the true garage band.
And how does it feel to become a yellowish drawing, ending up as a special guest in The Simpsons?
I know, the yellow skin. There are some people, I hope they are not in this audience, who think that that is my greatest achievement, that I was a cartoon character in The Simpsons. My role in The Simpsons was to tell Lisa Simpson that when she stands up and says with complete adoration, "Oh, Miss Tan, I love the mother-daughter stories that you..." And I say, "That's not what my books are about. Sit down, I'm ashamed for the both of us." Poor Lisa, she's been in psychotherapy ever since, unable to read a book. Matt Grady, made me say those words. And when we were actually recording, he said, "Oh, okay, well that's pretty good." He said, "But be now even meaner to her." By the end of 20 takes, I was swearing to her. I was saying things I cannot say in a public library, but we did not use that version. Truly, Lisa would be in a psychiatric hospital.
And now a silly question. You have been married to the same man for 40 years, and you very funny, declared that the secret for a long relationship is to separate bathrooms, and separate closets. Yeah?
Yes.
So any plans to write a counseling book for couples?
Two-bathroom marriage. Actually, somebody asked me, "Well, where's Lou?" Today we were somewhere. "Where's Lou?" And I said, "Oh, he's back in the hotel washing my clothes." So I add that to Secret of a Good Marriage. Lavador. Somebody who washes your clothes. That's a good husband. It's actually, I will, to be honest, I think that he's here. There he is. He's standing up. He doesn't have too many wounds on his face, you know, he's like in one piece. I think a lot of it is being independent, maintaining an independent self, but also sharing a lot, sharing the same values, sharing fun. I think that the fun is really important. There were members of our Rock Bottom Remainder band, those spouses who never came to the shows, who believed that the members of the band were being childish, they got divorced. There's somebody who are divorced in the band, and it was every single one that was because the spouse wouldn't go to the show. Lou, on the other hand, has always performed with the band as the leader of the pack, who's the guy on the motorcycle who falls off the motorcycle and dies. And so much so that he actually broke his collarbone, being a little too good in acting out his part. So I was saying, having fun together, sharing the same values. And what I mean by that it has a lot to do with the importance of family, and also about generosity and kindness. And you know, it's very hard to be with a person who has a different sense of generosity than the other. The importance about independence is that you remain an interesting person in your own right, and the other person appreciates that for you. I will have to say, it's not that everything has to be the same, but I would have a very, very hard time being in love with somebody who was a Republican. The fact that we vote pretty much the same way, I think that's been a benefit.
And Fred, that you're not a Tea Party fan, no? Besides that.
The only time I'm a Tea Party fan is when I'm drinking tea with someone at a party I invited. Yes, no, I'm not a fan.